thank you, Gil, for jumping on. And maybe you could talk a little bit about your background, what you currently do, and what your job is.
Sure. So I started my civilian career working for Sprint way back in the early days, pre-internet, and I actually launched Sprint's first commercial dial-up ISP in 1995. And from that time on, most of my career, my corporate career, was spent working with service provider, whether it was Sprint or cable companies or whatever. I left Sprint in 2015, and for the last decade or so, I've been working primarily with startups. And generally, those startups are startups that have proven their value prop and are starting to get traction in the marketplace, but now they need to scale. And they're confronting the reality of all of the debt that they incurred and deferred to enable them to get to the traction point that they were seeking. And so usually come in to help them establish sort of the frameworks and the structures that enable the business to scale. A lot of stuff around clock and calendar and cadence of operation and, those types of things. So some program management, some project management, some business strategy, a lot of operational focus.
Okay. How long does a typical contract like that last?
Well, I can do anything from short-term engagements, 2 to 3 months, to basically just, do a triage and a diagnosis and an action plan. In most cases, I generally prefer to join the company. And, that's usually a 2 to 3 year ride. Either the company exits or the company flames out, or, they scale to a point where they want to go more specialized. And so the functions that I was doing or break out to a variety of people, and I generally move on to a new opportunity at that point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you've kind of had a really broad range of working with a lot of companies at this point, and you've helped consult, help grow, primarily startups from what it sounds like. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm curious how Atlassian might fall into a strategy or a solution that you might potentially implement or suggest for a company that is in the startup phase, and how that might help them out when they're still growing.
Well, generally what you find when you join these companies is that they have been nose down trying to get a product built and proven in the marketplace. And, we often talk a lot about technical debt, but there's the same thing on the business side. There's business debt. And what you'll find is there's very little in the way of documentation. There's very little in the way of sort of process management enablement tools. Ton of Excel spreadsheets flying around. People are just basically winging it to get to the next, step on their checklist of things they need to do. And now all of a sudden you've got something that's worked one time or 10 times or 100 times, and you've got to make it happen 1,000 times or 10,000 or 1,000,000 times. And you need to start applying some rigor to the way that you do things. And so, there's a variety of things that you need. You need some way to manage your project portfolio. You need to understand the work that's being done in the organization and have your leadership team be able to prioritize that and help give people guidance on, what's the most important things, all the way down to allowing people to keep track at a task level of the things that they're actually responsible for doing today to advance the strategy moving forward. You need, obviously, documentation, the ability to have historical context around decisions that were made or actions that were taken. Capturing that information in a knowledge base of some form. One of the reasons the reason I first got involved with Atlassian was I was working with a startup, and they were very passionate about open source tools, and they were using an open source wiki, and they were using an open source ticketing system, and, an open source this and an open source that. None of them integrated with each other. And, they were open source. And so, they weren't necessarily the most powerful, nor integrated solutions. And so the primary driver for that company is that this was way before COVID hit and everybody discovered the joys of working remotely, but they were a 100% remote company. So, and they had developers and employees around the globe. And so one of the mantras was write it down, because the only way that a remote organization could actually maintain context and continuity was if actions were captured in a way that somebody could come online 12 hours after you did it on the other side of the world and actually know what it was you were working on, why you did what you did, and also to reinforce the culture of the company, your policies, all of that type of information. You need some centralized location where that information resided. So that was, a driver for my first foray into looking at both Jira and Jira and Confluence.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that a lot of these companies use Excel, Word docs, and that's something I've come across fairly often as well, and something that Grid.io helps with. We come across a lot of teams that use some kind of spreadsheets, some kind of documents. What are the biggest downsides that you've noticed within those companies that use that type of an approach?
Right. I'd actually say these days you're more likely to find people who are using Google Suite than necessarily back in those days, you bought this Office productivity suite, and everything wasn't in the cloud, and so obviously Excel's got a 25-year track record, and but I find lately most of the companies that I engage with, they've jumped onto free or near free kind of Google enticements, and so whatever the tool is, what you find is one of the big issues with using Excel for project management or program management is it's static, and it lacks context, and it lacks history. And so, you may be doing a daily stand-up and you're reprioritizing your stack on the fly, but you're deleting things, which is your method of archiving, unless you cut and paste them to another tab in the spreadsheet, and then they're all in there, and whatever the last in sort of order that you pasted them in there. You don't have context, you don't have history, you don't have the ability to prioritize, you don't have the ability to kind of pivot the view in a way of kind of looking at it in this fashion, maybe in a list fashion, and then you want to look at it from a calendar perspective, or whatever, or you want to look at it in a workflow kind of a structure. So what happens is, and the other problem is outside of that, for product program management or project management, people are authoring documents all over the place, snippets here, stuff is buried in emails. You lose complete context of why a decision was made, what the impacts of it were. And so what I find is the ability to have some centralized store, I want to say centralized, but some sort of aggregated store of all of the knowledge that your organization needs to run on, and the ability to pull it in from external sources, hopefully in automated fashion sometimes. I know in the last project that we worked on, we were, very ambitious about trying to get Slack integration pulled in, because we wanted people to work in the tools they were comfortable with, but we also didn't want to lose, the tribal knowledge of, what was being discussed or decided in those Slack channels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And you've already touched on part of this, but what are some of the key differences or the most unique things that you've seen about Atlassian, Jira, Confluence versus other tools? And you kind of mentioned open source tools, but there's obviously other project management tools out there. There's a list of 100 of them.
Right.
So what are some of the big things that you've liked about Jira and Confluence as a whole?
Well, when I first started with Atlassian, I used to say that Atlassian was the Ikea of project program management tools, because it was extremely powerful. You could do a lot of things with it, but you had to do some assembly to get it running. And I have to say, over the last 7-8 years that I've worked with it, they've made some pretty good strides in terms of getting you closer to being out of the box in terms of being able to spin something up.
Mm-hmm.
I think, the value that I think I saw in Atlassian compared to some of its competitors was the ever increasing integration between task management, treating something as a task, and also the associated information that goes with it. And I will say sometimes I'm a little frustrated with, the sort of the ticket-based approach to trying to shoehorn into everything to looking like a ticket. And
Mm-hmm.
I actually worked on a Jira Confluence. I was a participant in an organization that was implementing Jira and Confluence, and they were trying to essentially place the entire organization inside an agile methodology. And that included administrative functions, planning functions, functions that literally were not sort of ticket-driven organizations and not sprint-driven organizations. They had different cadences and different work rhythms. And so sometimes that context could be a little constraining, but I have to say over the last couple of years of working with Atlassian, I've gotten a little more comfortable with some of the flexibility that started to show up. I mean, when they pulled in some of the
Mm-hmm.
Trello-like features and started letting people look at their work in that fashion as opposed to a bunch of the tickets flying around, the marketing team writing tickets to each other to, do some ad campaign. And, the marketing team's like, this is crazy. We don't work this way. But, that's the model they were being forced to work in. So I've seen the things that they've pulled in the last few years make that less of an issue for, sort of non-ticket or code pull type work activities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great metaphor that you brought up. Like Atlassian's kind of like the IKEA of the project management industry, to where it takes some assembly, and that's what I see time and time again. Most companies would jump in once they get it configured and get the ball rolling. That's when it gets a lot easier to work with and a lot easier to use and manage, and just be able to have a streamlined project management software. It obviously does other things. There's the development side, the service management side, and then there's Confluence for documentation, wiki, knowledge management. But it definitely does take some configuration.
Yep.
Speaking of that, what would be one of the things that you would typically see in a company if they don't implement Jira or Atlassian in the right way? What are the biggest downfalls that they encounter?
Well, I think that you can. This is true with any project program management tool, code management tool, documentation management tool. You can get so wrapped up in the mechanics of the administration and the design that you can literally make the tool a barrier to people being
Mm-hmm.
successful. Because what you're trying to do is reduce friction. You're trying to enable people to achieve the value of the aggregated information, views, and things in a way that conform it with the way that they do their work. You're not trying to get people, I'm not saying in all cases that you don't do some process reengineering, but what you're not trying to do is force people to adapt new ways of working simply because you want to use a tool.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you get extremely rigid, and like I said, and one company that I worked with where they were extremely rigid about the way that they implemented Jira and Confluence as tools, it became sort of an administrative burden and overhead. And both the tool set and the agile process got a lot of, a bad reputation in people's minds because of the rigidity of the way that, it was being implemented. So you can go a little too far on the
Mm-hmm.
trying to get everything right side. And what, you end up doing is, creating obstacles to progress rather than smoothing the way for people to work better, faster, more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something I notice a lot with particularly service management projects. So if you have an IT team that's using a portal and they have 20 different request types with a bunch of required fields for all of them, in the end, if it's too complex or too much, there's too much criteria as to how the request needs to be filled out. Most end users just end up going through and finding the simplest form, trying to find the way to get the quickest response from the team. And what you mentioned is that there needs to be a balance. There needs to be a line of there needs to be some rigidity and some structure, and there needs to be still the ease of use of the platform. How would you go about finding that happy medium, that right in the middle of we need enough rigidity as well as flexibility from the end user perspective?
Well, I find that, the best way to get started with the tool is to just start using it. Get a minimalist configuration together. People will start expressing what they think is missing. It's better to be rolling the tool out, satisfying requests for what's missing than, coming from the top down with let me put you in a classroom for 5 days and teach you how you're going to use this tool. And so they're absorbing all of this change at one time. Your IT service management example is a perfect example of, as a manager, I'm thirsty for data. I want to know everything about everything because I want to be able to triage. I want to analyze. I want to troubleshoot. I want to root cause analyze. You can get extremely, extremely in the weeds on the level of information that you're asking for from people in a ticket or, whatever. And you're correct. What will happen is the poor guy that actually then has to ingest all of that data and, prep it and analyze it ends up having to do a lot of interpretation because everybody's cut corners just to get the required fields filled out and, get something recorded so they can, move on with their work. So I find lightweight implementations, are the best way to start. And especially if you're trying to replace an existing process, there's a built-in sort of inherent resistance to the idea of process in people's minds because it equals bureaucracy in their thinking. But people never stop to think that however you're doing the work is a process, whether it's elegant or inelegant or efficient or inefficient. You have a process for everything that you do and, in your work. And so finding a way to find the pain points that are most prevalent in the way that people are currently doing their work and addressing those as sort of your intro to the tool really gets you much further down the implementation path more quickly. And like I said, it starts spawning those requests. Like the last engagement that you and I worked on together, we did a simple ticketing system. And within a week, I probably had a 6-month development backlog of, hey, can it do this? Can we do this? And then other business functions started showing up saying, hey, can we put this into Atlassian? Can we put this into Atlassian? Because again, early stage startup, thirst for access to historical data, access to procedures, policies, documenting what we're doing, why we're doing it. And people are aspiring to be the best at their work and their job, and they want to make things easier for themselves and the people around them. So lightweight will, get your toe in the water. And, the organization will kind of respond in ways that tell you where to go next.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that a lot of these other business teams, business departments, they kind of start to realize that Atlassian's capable and it could be used for a lot more than just a ticketing software or a development team. What are some of the more creative ways or unique use cases that you've seen from Atlassian and Jira within an organization?
It's interesting for me because I'm working mostly with early stage startup companies. And, my history's been that, either they've exited or flamed out or whatever. I've never seen an organization I've worked with actually get to a level of sophistication with Jira and Atlassian where they kind of broke the tool or, they went beyond the capabilities of the tool because they were just so kind of immature at the start, and it takes some time. And I'm talking about, calendar months and years for things to proceed to a level of maturity. So, there were a lot of things that I think you might aspire to in your mind in terms of integration across systems, integration with external customers. The more you can kind of weave all of your extant data sources and systems of record together, the more you, sitting back from a program and process management perspective, can kind of zero in on the pain points and, improve efficiency of operations. So I think, the innovative ways to do it, I know obviously we were working with a company that had units in the field, and, their big thing was being able to record audio, video on site as part of the ticket, so that whoever was picking the ticket up back in the triage center was able to have, on-site, real-time sort of context for the things that they were doing. I'm trying to think about, the big sort of burdensome implementation that I worked on. They really aspired to be able to link progress. They were trying to implement scaled agile framework, and they were really aspiring to use Atlassian tools to be able to look all the way from the portfolio and business strategy level down, so that a senior executive could actually drill in on an issue all the way down to the individual artifact that the person doing the work was using to manage their work. They wanted to have that. It's been the desire of companies forever to have traceability from requirements to, product to code fix. There's also that same desire for traceability of, like, why am I doing this thing? And I can actually roll up and see the strategic drivers that are behind the work that I'm doing. So there was some interesting stuff that was being done there to try to implement sort of the portfolio management perspective of, how is this day-to-day work that I'm doing actually relevant to my business unit's objectives and my company's objectives over the course of the year.
I love that you mentioned that with all the companies that you worked with, and they were all startups, but you never took Atlassian to the breaking point, I guess, in a way. I've had a very similar experience, but I've also worked with a lot of enterprise clients, and I could probably, count on my fingers the amount of times where I said, hey, Jira just can't do this, or the combination of Atlassian tools, we just can't accomplish this. Between, the suite of software, the third-party plugins, everything else that Jira and Atlassian have to offer, there's just so much capability within the suite of tools that it's very difficult to get to a point where you're like, it just cannot do this. So it's great that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I would caveat, it did work, that one client that I did work with wasn't a very large enterprise, and they were trying to do very large enterprise stuff. And I'm talking cast of thousands. I mean, there were whole organizations that were involved in this effort. And so that's where I sort of got to see, a lot of the trying to push the tool harder than it really could. I would say, and again, I haven't done a project in the last year where I've actually been with a company where we brought in a tool set yet. But I would say there was a lot of difficulty in massaging the data in the tool itself, the Jira ticket base or whatever, into sort of very dynamic dashboards and, status displays and things like that. There was a lot of development effort. I mean, the one they weren't able to do it, but they had to do a lot of work, kind of coax that data into a consumable format. And I haven't seen, I saw that, like, they're able to, use, data starts with a T. well, I'm going to draw a blank, but Tableau. I'm
Oh,
familiar with
yep.
use Tableau and other tools, external tools now. So that may have progressed some.
Hmm.
That was around 2020 or so when I was working on that project. So in the last 4 years, they may have made some significant progress on that.
Hmm. What is one thing that you would change about Atlassian and Jira, whether that's like a tool change or a process change, functionality change? What is one thing that you bugs you the most and that you would change today?
Um, I don't know. Maybe this is heresy to Atlassian believer, but I've sort of always struggled with the ticket as sort of the foundational metaphor of the entire architecture. I mean, I know that's
Hmm.
the legacy that they came out of and the driver for their original tool set. And I know they've acquired a lot of tools since then and aren't driven by that. But I felt like a lot of times when I've sort of ran into headaches with implementation or desires to do things, it was because of the ticket-based metaphor as the foundation for everything that you do in
Hmm.
Atlassian.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that makes sense. I think they're slowly trying to push away from that, especially with the project management type of boards that they create, as well as a little bit more on the development side now. They call them issues at this point,
mhm.
and a lot of them are tasks, or
Right,
for development, they might be bugs, or there
right,
might be epics and initiatives, which are a little bit more ticket relevant.
right,
But they are kind of, I feel like, pushing away from that, especially for the more project management oriented teams.
right. Yeah, I always had kind of sense that the ability to kind of roll up into artifacts that weren't individual tickets was a hard thing to do. Like if you wanted
Hmm.
to define an epic, or if you wanted to define a sprint, or you wanted to, groom a backlog, or things like that, and you're trying to you're trying to actually have different levels of detail all the way down to the user story, but you need them to roll up into sort of macro elements. And
Hmm.
I just got the impression sometimes that there was a lot of arcane magic that went into people that were pulling those kind of views off. So, and could be revealing my lack of you know deep understanding of the power Atlassian tool set. But like I said, because most of the companies that I were working with were mostly early stage startups,
Hmm.
um, we really weren't getting, those guys just needed some tool to do some things to improve their efficiency and their ability
Right.
to work. So I don't know that we ever stressed it to the level there. And I sort of had the flip side with this enterprise customer where they were really trying to drive hard on the roll ups and the linkages. And so
Hmm.
that
Yeah, yeah.
that may colored my perspective a little bit.
That totally makes sense. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Gil, for joining the podcast, for chatting about Atlassian. It's been a pleasure. I love all of your thoughts and your perspective from someone who's already worked with so many companies. Sometimes you kind of get tunnel vision when you only work with one organization or one implementation of Jira, but it's great to have the perspective of someone who's worked with Atlassian across a lot of different organizations.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.